Go.
My name is Libby Horn from the American Friends of Versailles. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Making of the Château de Versailles Museum with Russel Kelley, part of the Making of the Great Museums of Paris series. Before we get started, I want to remind you that we are using a Zoom webinar format. This means you can only see the speakers, but no worries. You can use the chat line to communicate with all participants. Give it a try and tell us where you are listening from. We also ask you to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. They will be answered by our guest at the end of the talk. Please note, we will also send you a recording after a few days. This program is presented in partnership with the Alliance Française de Chicago and the Alliance Française Miami Metro, with communication support from the American Friends of La Louvre and the American Friends of Versailles, the Friends of the Domaine de Chantilly, the French Heritage Society, and the Federation of Alliances Françaises USA. I am a member of the board of directors of the Alliance of the American Friends of Versailles, and also a member of the women's board of the Alliance Française de Chicago. We have, through the years, worked together very closely, Chicago and the American Friends of Versailles. The reason for that is that our founding president of the American Friends of Versailles, Catherine Hamilton, lives in Chicago and also was involved in the establishing of the Women's Board for the Alliance Française de Chicago. When we started the AFB, many of the original supporters were from Chicago, and we were able to have a great partnership. We now have many people from across the country involved in this organization, and we hope that all of you would be happy to join us too. We have done a number of projects, which Russell is going to detail for you going forward, and you will hear what we have done as far as our contributions are concerned. We first became involved because the French organization Les Amis de Versailles, of which Catherine was a board member, became aware that the funding supplied by the French government was inadequate to do all of the projects that they needed to do for restoration and renovation at Versailles. We have done 3 projects, again, which Russell will give you the details on, and we are very proud of our continuing support of the Chateau. And because of our the structure that we set up, many of the charitable institutions, international cultural institutions, have set up similar organization and used us as their format. Russell, here is to you. Russel Kelley is the curator and moderator of the past 3 Winter's lecture series of the Grand Chateaux of the Loire and Ile-de-France, the Making of the French Gardens, and the Great Churches of Paris. He's lived in Paris for 30 years and is the author of The Making of Paris, the story of how Paris evolved from a fishing village into the world's most beautiful city. Russell, please join us now and share with us your story.
Thank you, Libby, and greetings from Palm Beach, and welcome to the 3rd in our series of 7 lectures about the making of the great museums of and around Paris, because today we will be talking about the Château de Versailles, which is not in Paris, it's 10 miles west of Paris. Last week, Françoise Mardrus gave a master class on the history of the Louvre Museum, which was the first museum founded in Paris in 1793. And today we'll talk about Versailles, which in fact contains two museums, one created in the 19th century and one created in the 20th century, as we will see. And much like the Louvre, Versailles is located in a former royal residence that was confiscated during the Revolution.
Russell,
Unlike the
Russell,
Louvre,
Russell,
which is
we cannot see your PowerPoint yet.
oh, that's now.
Not yet.
All right.
Our apologies. And while Russell is getting to share his screen, I just want to mention to Stanislas if we could get the everyone option on the chat line, because people can only see an exchange with hosts and panelists. So thank you for everybody for telling us where you're listening from. I see Palm Beach, Oregon, Paris. I see Chapel Hill. So we definitely have a crowd that comes from everywhere. San Antonio, Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. So thank you for being with us today as we will launch into the discovery of Versailles, and it's the palace, but not only the palace, but also the museum. I also see Fort Worth, Texas. Maybe Russell will have to leave and come back.
Trying to do just that.
Can
you see it now?
Right now yes, you're there. Okay. Sounds good. You're on that, Russell. Thank you so much.
Apologies to all. So now we're going to talk about the making of the Museum of the Château de Versailles. And I'm going to go through the history of the chateau, because unlike the Louvre, which is all, it was completely adapted to become all the rooms were modified in order to display the art. Much of the Château de Versailles is itself part of the museum. So I will give you the history of the chateau, which is relevant to the history of that part of the museum, the history of the two museums. We'll also discuss some of the back office of the museum, the curators and conservators who create the exhibitions and preserve so many of the objects of art that are on display there, and how the museum is funded through the philanthropy of organizations like the American Friends of Versailles and other supporters. It all started at the Château de Vaux-le-Vicomte, actually, which is located 34 miles southeast of Paris. Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of finance, hired three brilliant architects and designers to create a spectacular chateau: Louis Leveau, Charles Lebrun, and André Lenôtre, to create this jewel of Baroque architecture. And the unique thing about it is that it was built within only 5 years. And all three of these artists were collaborating, resulting in a remarkable unity of architecture, interior, and landscape. And Lenôtre designed his gardens to be viewed from the chateau, creating perfect symmetry. Fouquet invited Louis XIV, a very young Louis XIV, who had just come back from marrying Maria Teresa of Spain, to the inaugural gala of his chateau. And he was received by Louis XIV was received, and it did not go well because Louis determined that the chateau was a bit too grand for a superintendent, so perhaps the money came from sources that should have been his. In any event, Louis ordered the arrest of Fouquet shortly after the gala, and then problems with the slides. Moved over to Versailles. His project started in Versailles immediately after the inaugural ball at Vaux-le-Vicomte. And Versailles is the result of the work of four kings, Louis XIII and XIV, XV, and XVI. It all started as a modest hunting lodge by Louis XIII, who then transformed it into a small chateau that probably looked a little bit like this. And then Louis XIV, his son, determined that he would replace that chateau or augment that chateau to create a much grander palace. And he brought over the very three artists who had worked on Vaux: Louis Le Vaux, Charles Lebrun, and André Le Nôtre. The three principal architects at Versailles were Louis Le Vaux, and also during Louis XIV's lifetime, Jules Hardouin-Monsard, and then later, under the reign of Louis XV, Ange-Jacques Gabriel. And the construction of Versailles kind of went in fits and starts depending on the wars that Louis was fighting. When he was involved in a war, he was using all of his money to pay for the war. When peace was declared, he resumed construction at Versailles. Went through four phases during his lifetime. Phase one was when Louis Le Vaux added two service wings in front of the original chateau built by Louis XIII. A little bit later, Louis Le Vaux added an envelope around the original chateau built by Louis XIII, as shown in darker gray on the outside of the original palace, shown also in gray on this image, with the original palace being in brick. The new envelope added state apartments for the king and queen, as well as a marble courtyard inside the old chateau with striking black and white tiles that were taken from Vaux. It is here where the first performance, or the performance of the opera Céleste, took place in the Grand Divertissement de Versailles. There was no place big enough in the chateau, therefore the performance was held outdoors in the marble courtyard. On the garden side of the chateau, Le Vaux built a new Italianate facade with a terrace roof connecting the king's wing on the left and the queen's wing on the right. Le Vaux was succeeded by Jules Hardouin-Monsard as the king's first architect, and he worked on many projects, but we will be talking about Versailles, where he extended the chateau in many ways. First, on either side of the envelope facing the garden in this photo, this image, he built the south wing on the right, and then the north wing on the left. Gigantic wings, 650 yards long from end to end. On the right wing were the apartments of the princes, and on the left, apartments of the high aristocracy. In between the two wings, Hardouin-Monsard built the famous Galerie des Glaces, the Hall of Mirrors, a spectacular 73-meter long gallery with mirrors on the inside wall facing the arches overlooking the garden. with a ceiling painted by Charles Lebrun, located here. The hall could accommodate 1,500 courtiers, and it was used for great receptions of the Doge of Genoa, the Siamese ambassador, and the Persian ambassador shortly before the death of Louis XIV. Other outbuildings designed and constructed by Ardouin Moussard include the ministers, the ailes des ministres, the wings of the ministers, shown on the right two arrows on either side of the big courtyard, where the ministers had their offices, and on the very left, the Grand Commun, which was more for administrative support. These are the two ministers' wing face each other across the Cour d'Honneur, and the Grand Commun is slightly behind the left side of the wing of the ministers. And then beyond the courtyard, on the other side of a great place d'armes, are the great and small stables built by Ardouin Moussard. The king and the court moved from Paris to Versailles in 1682, and ultimately between 3,000 and 10,000 people were at the palace each day, depending on what was going on. Ardouin Moussard built the Orangerie. Interesting fact that when one of the world wars wasn't going so well, Louis XIV had to melt down all of the silver furniture in the Galerie des Glaces to fund his wars, and replaced the furniture by gilt wood furniture, which in turn was replaced by new furniture commissioned for the marriage of the future Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And is that furniture which is in the Galerie des Glaces today. Louis XIV, is a remarkable portrait. Just after beginning the final phase, the fourth phase of the construction of Versailles during his lifetime, which was the construction of the Royal Chapel. Located in the north wing. He was succeeded, Louis XIV, by his great-grandson, who lived in Paris for his early years when he was a young infant, really, but returned to Versailles in 1722, and this is what it looked like when he got back. And this is what the spectacular Garden of Le Nôtre looked like during the reign of Louis XV. Louis XV held a masked ball in the Hall of Mirrors in 1745 and expanded the king's private apartment. So this is really the layout of the apartments that remained up until the Revolution. His architect was Jean-Ange-Jacques Gabriel, and among other things, he built the Royal Opera. It was an idea of Louis XIV, but it wasn't actually built until Louis V, late in the reign of Louis XV. It's here that the future Louis XVI, known as the Dauphin, and Marie Antoinette of Austria were married. And they celebrated the marriage in part with a performance, an inaugural performance in the Royal Opera in 1770. To light the room during the performance required 3,000 candles. Opera is located at the end of the north wing. And finally, with the construction of the opera, the Palace of Versailles, as we know it today, was completed. Louis XVI did little to change the Palace of Versailles. He did give Marie Antoinette the Petit Trianon, where she built the Hameau de la Reine, kind of a rustic farm village. And then we shift to the impact, the next 200 years. And the impact of civil and external wars on the Museum of the Château de Versailles cannot be overstated. The first and greatest change, of course, was the Civil War, the Revolution of 1789 to 90, which went on for 10 years. During that time, the Versailles and other royal properties were confiscated. Many early revolutionary events took place at Versailles. The Estates General that ultimately ended up with forming the National Assembly, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man took place at Versailles. On October 5th, women marched from Paris to Versailles, demanding that the king and his family return to Paris, which they did the following day. And that was the last day that a king resided in Versailles. Louis XVI remained on the throne, however. It was a constitutional monarchy, no longer the absolute monarchy of the Ancien Régime. However, Louis XVI and his family tried to flee Paris, but were caught shortly before near the border of Germany in Varennes and forced to return to Paris. Shortly thereafter, the Tuileries Palace was stormed by a mob, resulting in the death of 800 Swiss guards. And shortly thereafter, Louis himself was arrested and tried for treason in December 1792 and convicted and executed, decapitated on the Place de la Révolution in January, followed by his wife, Marie Antoinette, in October 1793. Place de la Concorde was subsequently at the end of the Terror renamed the Place de la Concorde. Place de la Révolution was renamed the Place de la Concorde. When Louis was arrested, the monarchy was dissolved shortly thereafter, and all of the property of the monarchy was confiscated. There was a decree that was passed a year later saying, however, that the buildings and gardens of Versailles will not be sold, but will be preserved for the pleasure and enjoyment of the people. So what happened to the property inside the chateau? Well, the paintings, antique sculptures, and jewels went to the newly created Musée Central des Arts, now known as the Louvre Museum. The books and medals went to the National Library. The clocks and scientific instruments went to the Conservatoire des Arts et Métiers, where they still are. And the animals in the Royal Menagerie went to the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle, which had its own zoo. But the remaining contents of the palace were sold at auction during a one-year period in 17,000 different lots. So at the end in August 1794, the palace had been totally emptied of its original contents, and it was used simply to store property confiscated from the nobility. One of the things that was sold at auction was the spectacular dinner service of Louis XVI that had been commissioned from the Sèvres porcelain factory. Only half of the dinner service had actually been created by the time of the Revolution. It was purchased at auction by one Monsieur Wurtz in Paris, who in turn sold the dinner service to the future King George IV of England, where it still resides today. It's the most costly service ever created by Sèvres. It's supposed to take 23 years to complete the service. It was not intended for general use. It was to be admired. To paint one large tureen tray, and the picture on the left is of a ice bowl, not a tureen tray, took one, but similar in complexity, took one artist nearly a year or more, working 10 hours, up to 10 hours a day to create. The one item that was not sold, of all the items in Versailles, the only item that was not sold at auction was the only piece of furniture, I should say, that was not sold at auction, is the Bureau du Roi, built by the cabinet makers Aubin and Riesner. It was transferred to the Louvre after all symbols of the monarchy were removed. And speaking of which, all painted and carved symbols of the royalty were removed from all buildings, not only at the Versailles, but including Versailles. The royal gate was destroyed, the Cour Royale was cleared, the marble court lost its marble. So the revolution ended when Napoleon became first consul in 1799. Later, 5 years later, he became emperor of the French at the tender age of 35. But he did not have much to do with Versailles. He preferred Fontainebleau. He did not want to be associated with the Ancien Régime of the Bourbons. He, of course, was abdicated and was sent to St. Helena after losing the Battle of Waterloo, and was succeeded by the Bourbon Restoration. The two younger brothers of Louis XVI succeeded him. Louis XVIII, Louis XVII was a young son of Louis XVI who died while imprisoned in the Knights Templar Tower in Paris. And after Louis XVIII died, he was succeeded by Charles VIII. And they lived at the Palais des Tuileries, and they did not occupy Versailles either. Charles VIII was overthrown by the July Revolution and succeeded by his cousin Louis-Philippe, who was a constitutional monarch for 18 years. He too resided at Versailles, but he resided at the Tuileries, not at Versailles, but transformed Versailles into a museum dedicated to toutes les gloires de la France. It was a history museum, a museum of the history of France, characterized by the Gallery Hall of Battles on the first floor of the South Wing, which is even longer than the 73-meter long Galerie des Glaces. This is 120 meters long. It's gigantic. It features military conquests, in particular 33 large-scale paintings that were commissioned to reflect the great victories of France, starting with Clovis's defeat of the German tribe, the Alemanni, at the Battle of Tolbiac in 496, and going right through Napoleon's defeat of Austria at the Battle of Wagram in 1809. The gallery is reminiscent of the Grand Gallery of the Louvre, which had been transformed into the Musée Central des Arts 40 years earlier. In addition to the gallery, the Battle Gallery, Louis-Philippe built the Crusade rooms and 5 rooms in the North Wing. So the Hall of Battles is on the second floor of the South Wing. In order to create this museum, Louis-Philippe demolished the apartments of the princes and courtiers in the South, both the South and North Wing, and in part of the central building, to create vast exhibition halls. So the palace as a residence, as a royal residence, ceased to exist for all intents and purposes. Louis-Philippe, with his 5 sons at the inauguration, took 4 years to create the museum, à toutes les gloires de la France. Consisted at the end of his reign of 6,000 paintings, 2,000 sculptures, 35,000 drawings and engravings, and was the largest history museum in the world. Louis-Philippe was overthrown, like his cousin before him, this time by the June Days Uprising in 1848, and he was succeeded by the first president of the Second Republic, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of Napoleon I. And after serving as president for 3 years, Napoleon staged a coup and declared the Second Empire, and he became Napoleon III. because Napoleon I had a young son who had died in his 20s, who was given the title posthumously of Napoleon II. Napoleon III started a trend by hosting a giant banquet in honor of Queen Victoria in the Royal Opera at the time of the first Universal Exhibition in Paris in 1855. And Versailles would be used by subsequent leaders to impress foreign dignitaries and visitors right through today. Napoleon III declared war against Prussia in 1870, surrendered 6 weeks later at Sedan, was deposed, and the Third Republic was established. The war, however, did not end. The Prussians pushed on to Paris, which was surrounded by the Thiers fortification, named after Prime Minister Adolphe Thiers, and built between 1841 and 1846. Impressive wall surrounded by a giant moat and a glacis, a no man's land outside. So instead of attacking, the Prussians simply put Paris under siege during a 4-month period during which the Prussians occupied Versailles. It was during that time, during the siege of Paris, that the Germans proclaimed the new German Reich, which was the Second Reich. The first empire was that of Charlemagne in the Hall of Mirrors, which is viewed as a great humiliation for France. Paris surrendered on January 28th. The Prussians occupied Paris, camped out on the Champs-Élysées. Finally, after details of the surrender were formalized, the Prussians marched down the Champs-Élysées on March 1st and departed. And then began, 17 days later, the Commune. The Parisians who had not fled were not able to flee because they were too poor during the siege, resisted the attempts of the government of France to reassert control over the city. And the first barricades went up. They closed the city to the federal troops. The Commune ended in the Bloody Week at the end of May 1871, and on May 24th, the Communards set anything associated with the government ablaze, including in the foreground here, the Tuileries Palace, which was demolished. It ended, this Bloody Week, and the Commune ended with the Mur des Fédérés, where the last 147 holdouts were shot dead. And the Third Republic of France was proclaimed at the Château de Versailles. For the earliest version was in 1870. It was formally declared through there were constitutional amendments that took place in 1875, which created a bicameral legislature. During the siege of Paris and the Commune, the government moved from Bordeaux to Bordeaux, but after the Commune, they moved back to Versailles. They moved to Versailles, and the National Assembly occupied the Royal Opera. When the bicameral arrangement was imposed in 1875, the National Assembly moved to a new hall built in a central courtyard, and the Senate moved into the Royal Opera. The government finally moved back to Paris in 1879. This is the Salle du Congrès, where the National Assembly met. And the Royal Opera, this is what it looked like when the Senate met there, and it was only restored to use by the Chateau, restored by the Senate to the use by the Chateau in 1950. So during the Second Empire and the early years of the Third Republic, the curators continued to expand the Museum of History. The early curators created the collections from artwork representing famous events and figures of French history taken from royal residences and furniture storehouses. Some paintings were brought from the Louvre. The early curators filled gaps in the collection by commissioning retrospective works by contemporary artists. By the late 19th century, all of these historic galleries and rooms had been created by the curators. But the later curators removed the retrospective works and replaced them with original works that were contemporary to the event or figure portrayed, with the sole exceptions of the large-scale paintings commissioned in the Battle Gallery and the Crusades Room, as well as in the States General Room. But apart from these rooms, where the History Museum was, the palace was left to fall into ruin until 1892, and when the second museum was initiated, a so-called house museum that was created thanks to the initiative of dedicated curators, of which I will focus on two, Pierre de Nolhac and Gérard van der Kemp. And their efforts were aided significantly by the Fifth Republic, by private donors, and by Versailles' transfer in 1995 to the legal entity, an établissement public. There were many curators. I'm focusing on Pierre de Nolhac and Gérard van der Kemp, who were the most influential because, among other things, they were there the longest period of time, 8 years and 27 years, respectively. Pierre de Nolhac started in 1892 and determined to restore the royal residence as it was at the end of the Ancien Régime. In other words, just before the revolution. And his principal accomplishment was to start the arduous process of tracking down and acquiring the first historic furniture, paintings, sculptures, and objects, and to install them in the rooms where they had been before the revolution. He was greatly aided in this task by a very detailed inventory of all of the auctions, the 17 lots of auctions that took place between 1793 and 94. Most of the furnishings were owned by museums and therefore were difficult to get. You couldn't compel them unless they were French museums, but many had been sold and were transferred overseas. So as a result, de Nolhac targeted items held by private individuals, and he was aided in the acquisition by funds provided both by the state and by private donors. And it really was the beginning of private philanthropy. The restoration of the royal residence took place in the central building, where the Hall of Mirrors is, and the north and south wings were left as transformed by Louis-Philippe. So essentially, this is what he was working with, the layout of the royal apartments as expanded by Louis XV. The royal residence essentially consists of the King's State apartments, inner apartments, private apartment, the Queen's State apartment, inner apartment, private apartment, and the apartments for the royal children. On the first floor, this is just the first floor, and there's other rooms on the second floor. And above, there were 31 rooms alone that were all in terrible shape. So to help pay for this restoration, de Nolhac cultivated outside patronage, receiving the King of Norway in 1907. And he was instrumental also, de Nolhac, in creating the Société des Amis de Versailles and cultivating donors that way. World War I started. The museum initially closed, but reopened shortly after the battle lines more or less became fixed and Versailles was no longer under threat. It welcomed troops, protected works, but later on in the war, the bombing started. They had to protect the works of art. So mobilized troops would leave from Versailles. Sculptures in the garden were protected. And late at the end of the war, defensive trenches were actually built around Versailles because it was considered within the perimeter of Paris. Finally, the war ended. The great leaders met at Versailles with de Nolac and very satisfyingly signed the Treaty of Versailles, ending the Great War in the Hall of Mirrors, where the Second Reich had been proclaimed in 1871. This is what it looked like. De Nolac retired, a job well done, but during the war, all the funds had been focused on the battle fronts, and the museum was left to dilapidate. And certainly after the war, Paris had no funds after this catastrophic war, which cost them 1 million lives and unlimited money. They had no funds to repair the chateau or any other museum. So when John D. Rockefeller visited Versailles, he was dismayed to see the poor state of repair of the chateau and resolved to help in the restoration of the chateau, writing 2 big checks in 1924 and 1927, which was the beginning of American philanthropy to Versailles. And in recognition of that fact, in 1936, the Avenue Rockefeller was proclaimed outside the chateau. In the 30s, the Nazi movement got underway in Germany, and they produced this poster in 1931, gegen Versailles, against Versailles, recalling the fact that they had been humiliated in turn by having to sign the peace treaty in Versailles in 1918. The Sudetenland crisis of the summer of 1938 made it very likely that there would be another war between Germany and the rest of Europe. But it was averted thanks to the Munich Agreement, which was an appeasement, but nobody should have been in any state of illusion that that would resolve the problem. So as a result, in August 1939, the Palace of Versailles closed, and in October, the artwork was packed up and shipped to various chateaux in the south of France or stored in the Orangerie, including the statues in the garden. Sculptures that could not be moved were protected with sandbags. Inside the chateau, wood paneling was removed and taken off site. Firewalls were installed at both ends of the Hall of Mirrors. Finally, 2 days after the invasion of Poland, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany, beginning of the phony war. Windows of Versailles were boarded up. The Grand Canal was drained so that it wouldn't serve as such an easy target or reference point for aviation. Nevertheless, the Germans invaded France on May 10th, and they occupied Versailles and Paris on June 14th. The Germans demanded the restoration of the museums, so the statues were returned to the gardens. Some, but not all of the collections were returned to the museums, and the museum partially reopened in June of 1941. And among the first and most visitors were the German soldiers themselves, and they produced a brochure for them, an illustrated guide, Ein Tag in Versailles. So they would be able to visit the Hall of Mirrors, the Gallery of Battles, the gardens. The Grand Canal was transformed during that period from this, when they drained it, a much narrower little channel was created, which was supposed to be more deceptive because there was still water in the wider sections of the canal, which was overgrown. And finally, sheep were actually out there mowing the lawn, so to speak. During the war, there was no heating in the chateau, cold winters, and the roof was in terrible repair, resulting in leaks, frequent leaks, which resulted in the collapse of the central section of the painted ceiling in the Queen's Guard room, and many other damages. The Allied troops liberated Versailles, and they in turn visited the Hall of Mirrors and the Gallery of Battles. The war finally ended on the 8th of May, 1945. And a year later, Versailles gradually reopened to the public. The water features were filled again, the remaining collections were returned, and the restoration began once again. And the curator who was primarily responsible for that restoration was Gerald van der Kemp, who is considered to be the savior of Versailles. Dapper fellow. Just his list of achievements over the 27 years that he was there is long, as you can see. Restored and reopened the Royal Opera, restored the Grand Trianon, restored the Cour de Marble Courtyard, reopened and then restored the Petit Trianon, reacquired the Grande Écurie, the stables that had been occupied by government offices, restored the fountains and the gardens, the Queen's bedchamber, restored the King's bedchamber, restored the Galerie des Glaces. And he also carried on the tradition of using Versailles as he and the president, prime minister, I should say, of using Versailles as a symbolic and a political place to receive celebrities. Here, after the reopening of the Royal Opera, after its restoration, so Queen Elizabeth attended the reopening. There was a refurnishing policy that had been started by de Nolac to track down, identify, repurchase original furnishings of the royal residence and place them in their original location. This effort, once again, just like de Nolac, was supported largely by private and corporate donors. Rockefellers came to the rescue once again with 100 million franc donation in 1958 to restore the Queen's Hamlet, Petit Trianon, and the French Pavilion in the Trianon Gardens. One of the earliest things to return to Versailles was the King's desk that had been sent off, you'll recall, to the Louvre during the Revolution, and it was returned through gritted teeth because the Louvre and no museum liked to lose such spectacular items to their in their collections. So to the rescue came the Fifth Republic, led by President Charles de Gaulle and André Malraux, the first Minister of Cultural Affairs. And they both supported the politique de grandeur. France stands out. And one of the ways that they wanted to impress people was by using Versailles, and it worked. So they hosted, for example, the Kennedys at the Royal Opera in their visit in 1971. And they hosted the Duke of Edinburgh at the Grand Trianon after its restoration in 1966. And they passed a number of decrees and laws that helped Versailles establish the Ministry of Cultural Affairs. Significantly, in 1961, required the return to Versailles of all furnishings that were present in other museums and government buildings, and enlarged the protected perimeter around the Château Versailles, and gave a significant 120 million franc grant to the restaurant of Versailles and Trianon, as well as Fontainebleau. So after this new decree, the painting, the feast at the House of Simon, was returned to the Salon d'Hercule in the Versailles from the Louvre in 1961. Another initiative undertaken by the Fifth Republic was the creation of the Fondation de France, which is a little bit like a large community chest organization where people could park small foundations or endowments and have them administered by the state. It was inspired by American foundations and endowment funds. In 1969, there were 15,000 foundations in the United States and 250 in France. It worked. There are now 2,700 foundations in Fondation in France, along with 2,000 fonds de dotation, which means endowment funds, which were only allowed in 2008. Gerard van der Kemp married Florence Bennett Harris van der Kemp, from Washington, D.C. in 1962, and she founded the Versailles Foundation in 1970 as a way to raise funds. And fundraising under the Van der Kemps reached a new level, as demonstrated by the fashion show they arranged at Versailles in 1973, featuring 100 models and performers who before 700 guests. And it was basically a battle of the American fashion designers on the right and the French fashion designers on the left. And it was attended by the great and the famous. And the performers were world-class performers in the opera, and the event raised $260,000 for the restoration of Versailles in 1973, 50 years ago. So back to restoration. So the Grande and Petite Écuries were built by Ardouin-Moussard, were reacquired from government departments that had occupied them. And the Coach Gallery was transferred to the Grande Écurie, the Great Gallery, in 1978. Restoration work continues within the palace itself. This is what the Queen's bedchamber looked like after the removal of the paneling before World War II. And it was restored to look like this. That is quite a restoration challenge. And imagine that in virtually all of the rooms. You had to go through that kind of restoration. The bedchamber, King's bedchamber, was restored in 1980. The Hall of Mirrors as well, and the marble courtyard as well, all of which earned the Palace and Park of Versailles a World Heritage Site designation from UNESCO in 1979. Versailles continued to serve a political purpose. François Mitterrand held the G7, the 8th G7 summit at Versailles, with dinner in the Hall of Mirrors, a show at the Royal Opera, and a concert in the Royal Chapel. That's carried on. And actually the joint sessions of Parliament, which means the National Assembly and the Senate, continue to meet in the Salle du Congrès that was built in 1876. But on rare occasions. It's actually been done once by Sarkozy, 2009, once by President Hollande in 2015, and once by Emmanuel Macron shortly after he was elected in 2017, where he hoped to create a tradition which is not followed through, of having annual addresses to the joint houses, much like the American president has the State of the Union address every year. And Emmanuel Macron hosted a state banquet for King Charles III on his first visit to France in his capacity as king just last September for 160 lucky guests. 1999, terrible storm hit Versailles, and for that matter, Paris. Versailles lost 10,000 trees. Shortly before, and they had to be replaced, and they were replaced thanks to, again, the efforts of private donors. So the American Friends of Versailles, as mentioned by Libby Horn earlier, was founded by Catherine Hamilton and Olivier de Rohan, who at that time was the president of the Société des Amis de Versailles in 1998. And they have funded four restoration projects. First was the reconstruction of the Bosquet des Trois Fontaines, the Grove of Three Fountains, created by André Lenotre. Pretty dramatic before and after. Second project, the restoration of the Pool Salon in the Trianon Garden. And the third is the restoration of the Queen's Guard Room, which had suffered severe water damage. And the current project, started in 2019, is the restoration of the Queen's Grove. In addition, public, personal philanthropy, I should say, private philanthropy was much helped starting in 2003 by the new law, Elegant, which provided tax incentives for charitable giving to charitable organizations and foundations in the public interest. France actually has the most generous tax incentives for charitable donations of any country that I believe that any country in Europe, or certainly the United States. Individuals can deduct 66% of the amount of their donations, capped at 20% of their taxable income. Companies can deduct 60% of the amount they donate, capped at 0.1% of their annual turnover. In the case of France's most valuable company, LVMH, their turnover in 2022 is 80 billion euros, and 0.5% of that is 400 million euros. That's a lot of money to be able to write off 60% of. Grand Versailles project started in 2004. More restoration. Much of the restoration work had to do with technical improvements, putting in electrical systems and security systems. But it also included restoration, important restoration of the Royal Gate, for example. And here's a rare acquisition of original furniture, a desk made by the cabinet or the furniture maker Riesner for Marie Antoinette. And it was donated to the chateau by two French companies, Sanofi Aventis and LVMH, who paid 6.75 million euros to acquire this desk. More restoration. It never stops. To restore the King's Chamber, which is underway, they have to restore the woodwork, the paintings, the flooring, the decoration, the marble around the fireplace, and the furniture. The Château de Versailles, the Domaine de Versailles de Trianon, is it's called a public establishment created in 1995. This is a new structure which provides administrative and financial autonomy to Versailles. I liken it, for lawyers out there, to a subsidiary, which has got its own management, or its own oversight, and is responsible for its own bottom line, rather than a branch, which is part of the head office. And the operating expenses are covered by the establishment's own resources. It's allowed to generate its own funds and keep the funds that it generates, which would not be the case if it were not an établissement public. There are many établissements publics administratifs, EPA, out there, all the museums that are listed on the left, and other institutions that are listed on the right. There are other types of établissements publics à caractère industriel et commercial, which can include, the best way to understand it is pretty much government-owned companies that provide, that are like utilities, such as before they were privatized, the electricity company, the gas company, the railroad, and the airport management company, or all EPIC. Where did the sort of revenue come from for Versailles? In 2022, is 189 million euros. 102 million of it came from state support. 87 million was raised by Versailles itself, including private donations in the amount of 14.5 million, which are used to pay for 75% of the cost of restoration work. How does Versailles generate its revenues? Through ticket sales primarily, but also sales to the shows at the Fountain, the Royal Opera, fees for private event, fees for filming at Versailles. There were 400 films that had some filming done at Versailles last year or in 2022. Royalties from trademark license, publications. They opened a hotel a couple of years ago called the Grand Contrôle, the museum shop with an online boutique. In order to attract more and a new public, they started featuring contemporary artists in 2008. Jeff Koons was the first one. Their boutique, their online boutique sells a remarkable variety of items, including these shoes. And if you want to adopt a bust in the marble courtyard, that's a possibility too. A word about the chief curators. This is a list of the ones since Pierre de Nolhac, and you'll see I've highlighted that virtually all of them since 1930 have been graduates of the École du Louvre and sometimes of the École du Patrimoine. So educators, how do the curators get educated? Well, they go to the École du Louvre or the École du Chartres. These are art history schools, as well as these other schools that I mentioned here, but I'm going to just focus on three. The École du Louvre, which is a grande école, meaning that you have to compete to get in, taking a special exam uniquely for that school, dedicated to the study of archaeology, art history, anthropology, and epigraphy. The École nationale des Chartes does the same thing, dedicated to training, but it emphasizes training curators. And the bottom one, the Institut National du Patrimoine, International Institute of Heritage, dedicated to training curators and conservators as well. The École du Louvre is located in one wing, the southwestern wing of the Louvre, the wing of Flore. And the École nationale des Chartes is located nearby on the Rue de Richelieu, as is the National Institute of Heritage, located in the Gallery Colbert Passage and right nearby. And you'll see that the speakers, all of the speakers in our series, have either gone to the École du Louvre or the Institut du Patrimoine, or both, and or are teaching at the École du Louvre. So the museum of the Château de Versailles consists of 2,300 rooms. Only 100 of them are dedicated, only 100 of them are dedicated to the history rooms, another 100 to the royal residence rooms, but not all of them are open all of the time, and not all of them that are open to casual visitors. Many of them you can only visit if you go on a guided tour. Last year, or 2022, visits were up to 6.9 after being down in the around 2 or 3 million during the COVID period. And they had a lot of even more visits to their extraordinary website. They're wonders, but they're made up of curators who went to the NSC or perhaps the École or other schools where they learn the fine art of restoring heritage furniture, upholsterers and furnitures and people who lay floors, of course, administrators, electricians and plumbers, guards and cleaners, and gardeners. I know there are 80 gardeners. The collection is, of course, vast. To maintain requires a vast team of 1,000 people. And I close by saying Versailles will once again be center stage this summer by hosting the equestrian and modern pentathlon events during the 2024 Summer Olympics. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you next week for the making of the Musée de Cluny of the Middle Ages. Thank you very much.
Russell, thank you so much for this presentation, so rich, so many things to consider on the long history of not only the Palace of Versailles, but also the Museum of Versailles. We have a couple of questions I saw on the chat line, the question box, so maybe I'll start with those, and then there are some other questions we know we'd like to ask you. First, very simple one, and I hope you know it's a bit precise. What was, from Catherine Korn, what was the date of the Kennedys' visit to the Grand Opera?
I think it was 1961.
There you go, Catherine. I knew Russell would know the answer to that because
it's on the slide, but I think it's
okay.
1961.
And as you know, Russell, there's always a lot of interest for some reason in the fountains and the engineering behind the fountains. We often get questioned about that. So the one I have here, let me just scroll back to find it. I think it was a little early on. Where is it? Ah, voila. It's from Patricia Bona. How did they manage to channel the water needed for the fountains and the irrigation of the gardens from that small town at the time of the Sun King?
Well, I didn't really talk much about the gardens in this. This talk is more about the building, but the gardens indeed required the fountains required a huge amount of water and water pressure. And so there were extraordinary measures taken to transfer water from a nearby river, building an aqueduct that went, I forget exactly how many, but several 5 miles more, maybe longer, to fill reservoirs that were kept at the top. Versailles, the chateau is at the top of a kind of a hill, and then the gardens go down the hill to the Grand Canal at the bottom. And so the idea is to get water from higher points to storage places, which include under the Grand Terrasse, literally in front of the Hall of Mirrors. And then the water goes down through pipes that are laid underground in the garden to the various fountains, and the gravity makes them operate. Unfortunately, there was never enough water or gravity to make more than one of them operate at a time. And so when Louis XIV would go on his strolls around, there would be people stationed at different fountains to say, okay, the king's coming, let's turn the water on for this fountain. And then he'd leave and they'd turn it on for the next fountain. They've worked it out now. They don't have to rely on gravity, so they can turn on more than one fountain at a time. But it's a highly complex situation.
Thank you for that. Now, I was a little fascinated by numbers and some of the numbers you mentioned. I think you said that the museum occupies only 200 of the 2,600 rooms. So what's going on in the 2,400 other rooms at Versailles?
Well, the formal title of the organization is the Domain of the Château of Versailles and Trianon. So there are actually quite a few, and the 200 rooms that I mentioned are all in the principal residence or the principal building of the Château de Versailles. And of course, there's the Grand Trianon, and the rooms in the 2,600 rooms include rooms in all of the other chateau, which is the Grand Trianon, the Petit Trianon, as well as in the Grande Écurie and the Petite Écurie, as well as in the Minister Aile des Ministres and the Grand Commun, the outbuildings. So there are a lot of buildings that are not included in where the museums are located, beyond where the museums are located. And those buildings are full of offices, because of course there's a huge administration involved in running Versailles, a lot of workshops for all of the restorers to work their magic in, a lot of storerooms for them to put all the materials, all the cloth, all the paint, and all the wood and other things that they need to do their restoration. There also is a private apartment for the president of the public establishment. There's also a house for the president of France to occupy when he wishes. And I dare say there's plenty of empty rooms that still need to be restored when the funds come through. Thank you, philanthropists.
Well, that brings us to philanthropy. First, thank you to Libby, who posted the percentage of visitor that comes to in 2022, when there were 26% of the visitor from France, more than 18% were American. So there's a strong interest always at Versailles for American tourists, which brings me to the question, how does the philanthropic support for museum in France differ or is different from in the US, the two countries being very different approach to supporting culture?
They certainly do have very different approaches. And France, ever since the welfare state created, well before that, but most recently after the welfare state was created, essentially after World War II, and particularly after the creation of the Ministry of Culture, particularly when you're talking about support of cultural institutions like museums. French mentality has mainly been, I'm paying my taxes to the government, and the government has a Ministry of Culture, and therefore they should look after, and a Center for Historic Monuments, they should look after these things. And I'm supporting by paying my taxes. So it's been an uphill battle, which has been waged by starting in the very earliest times by de Nolac with the creation of the Société des Amis du Louvre. Most recently, but the fact of the matter is, as the French would tell you, philanthropic giving is mainly an Anglo-Saxon, as they would call it, tradition. Rather amazingly, I saw a report about philanthropic giving in Europe, and half of all philanthropic giving in Western Europe is given by one country, and that is England. Because or the UK, because that is part of the philanthropic tradition there, and it certainly is here too. All of the museums that we're talking about in this series were created by the state, or not all of them. The Musée des Arts Décoratifs was not, but most museums in France the big ones are created by the state. All the great museums in America are created by the local community, except in Washington, D.C., where the government has created its own museums. But if you go to the Met in New York, to the Art Institute in Chicago, the Field Museum, whatever, they were all created by local benefactors and are supported by local benefactors. It is very much in the American tradition, and that's why the French tried to copy the American tradition by creating the Fondation de France, creating endowment, the Fonds de Dotation, and encouraging philanthropy through tax incentives, which of course were already present in the United States as an incentive. So we're ahead of the game on that for sure.
Merci, Russel. So the Battle of Versailles continue between French and American and their way to do things. I think that will be our last question for today because we're going on in time. It's 1:15. On this, I would like to bring back Libby Horn to close the program. To you, Libby.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you so much, Russell, for this wonderful presentation. I think that it is interesting to all to see what the history of Versailles has been. It is quite a varied and colored history, including having other countries involved, and it was just really a fascinating talk. Also, thanks to all of our partners for their support. Our special thanks go to all of you who have attended today. We encourage you to continue your attendance. Next week, February 2nd at 12 p.m. Central Time, 1 p.m. Miami time, Eastern Time, we will, or 1900 hours, I should say, in Paris for everyone. We will host a discussion on the Cluny Museum of Middle Ages. And so we encourage everyone to join us, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Au revoir.
Well,
Au revoir, merci.